Right now, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, a city is moving $13 billion of steel, 5,000 souls, 337 meters long, 9 months from the nearest shore. Every documentary gives you the jets, the fire, the spectacle. What they never give you is the truth behind the steel, how 5,000 ordinary human beings eat, sleep, work, and somehow hold their sanity together inside a sealed metal world with no windows, no exits, and no way home. That truth doesn't start with the weapons or the technology. It starts with the people and what it actually costs a human being to become one of them. The 5,000 people aboard USS Gerald R. Ford are not a single unified force. They are two entirely separate armies compressed into the same steel box. The first is the ship's company, roughly 3,200 sailors whose sole mission is to keep the vessel itself alive, the nuclear reactors, the engines, the weapon storage, the food supply, the communications, and every mile of wiring and plumbing running through 25 decks. The second is Carrier Air Wing, CVW 8, approximately 2,500 aviation personnel, with an entirely different mission to project lethal air power across a 1,000-mile radius. These two groups operate under separate commanders, live by different rhythms, and can go weeks barely crossing paths. Yet they breathe the same recycled air, share the same 337 meters of steel, and are expected to function as a single seamless organism. The tension between them is something no recruitment brochure will ever mention. They come from all 50 states. The average age sits between 19 and 24. A significant number had never left their home county before enlisting. A teenager from rural Montana who had never once seen the ocean is now monitoring nuclear reactor coolant systems beneath the waterline. A 20-year-old from South Chicago who joined to fund a college degree is now physically loading live AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles onto F/A-18Y on an active flight deck. 14% of the crew are women, a figure that sounds modest until you remember that women were entirely prohibited from serving aboard U.S. Navy combat vessels as recently as 1994. This ship is not a military abstraction. It is compressed into a single hull, a living portrait of an entire nation, its ambitions, its contradictions, and its people. Not one person aboard CVN 78 simply walked on. Before any sailor sets foot on the flight deck of Gerald R. Ford, they must first pass the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, a rigorous multi-hour exam that determines not just eligibility, but which of the ship's 60-plus specializations a candidate is qualified to fill. That is followed by 8 to 13 weeks of boot camp at Recruit Training Command Great Lakes, Illinois, a sustained program of physical stress and psychological pressure designed to dismantle civilian identity and rebuild it into something the Navy can rely on. Then comes A School, the technical training pipeline, ranging from 6 weeks for a basic supply rating, all the way to 52 grueling weeks for nuclear propulsion school, one of the most academically demanding programs in the entire U.S. military. By the time a sailor finally steps across the gangway of Ford, they have spent the better part of a year earning the right to be there. And then every single one of them gets completely, utterly lost. The ship contains over 2,500 individual compartments, 25 stacked decks, and miles of passageways that are to a fresh set of eyes. Completely indistinguishable from one another, the same gray bulkheads, the same gray pipes, the same gray overhead running endlessly in both directions. There are no color-coded maps, no arrows pointing to the mess deck, no friendly signage of any kind. The only navigation system is a code stenciled on every bulkhead frame number. Deck number, compartment number, a three-part coordinate that is perfectly logical, once memorized and utterly meaningless before that moment arrives. Most new sailors spend their first 48 hours arriving late, backtracking through identical corridors, and absorbing the silent contempt of senior enlisted personnel who have long since memorized every passageway like a second language. Gerald R. Ford does not pause for anyone to find their bearings. Here's the truth that every carrier documentary quietly skips over. More than 60% of the people aboard USS Gerald R. Ford will never fire a weapon, never sit in a cockpit, and never do anything resembling the footage you have seen in a Navy recruitment video. They are culinary specialists preparing over 18,000 individual meals every single day across 4 mess decks, running around the clock without interruption. They are hull maintenance technicians crawling into subdeck spaces barely large enough to turn around in welding pipe joints deep inside the ship. They are hospital corpsmen performing emergency surgery in a fully equipped operating room built into the belly of the vessel. The most junior sailor aboard a seaman recruit at pay grade E1 earns $1,785 a month, has no legal right to refuse a deployment order, and holds the entire operational ecosystem of this ship together through sheer, unglamorous, invisible labor. Without them, every single one of those $70 million jets sitting on the flight deck above is nothing more than expensive, perfectly grounded metal. For many of these sailors, the moment they step onto the gangway of Gerald R, Ford is the first time in their lives they have ever seen the ocean not from a beach, not from a vacation, but from the deck of the warship they will call home for the next 9 months. No window in their berthing compartment, no view of the horizon, no way to feel the scale of the water surrounding them except through the faint, constant vibration of 2 nuclear reactors running beneath their feet. The $13 billion machine they now live inside is the most sophisticated warship ever built, and it runs not on nuclear power, not on advanced technology, but on a 20-year-old cook who hasn't slept more than 5 hours, and a 22-year-old welder fixing a burst pipe at 2 in the morning, and 4,998 other human beings exactly like them. Out of those 60 specializations, which one do you think you could actually survive for 9 straight months? Drop your answer below. And if this already shattered what you thought hit, like right now, and don't go anywhere, because what comes next is where it gets truly hard to believe. Knowing who they are is only the first layer. The real question is, how do you take 5,000 human beings, 60 different jobs and 3 rotating shifts and wire them into a single machine that never once stops running? There is no democracy aboard USS Gerald R. Ford. There is no suggestion box, no open floor meeting, and no ambiguity whatsoever about who answers to whom at any level of this organization. The entire ship is divided into 18 departments: aviation, engineering, weapons, navigation, medical, supply, and more, each commanded by a department head sitting within a hierarchy so rigid it functions less like management and more like structural steel. Those departments fracture further into more than 50 specialized divisions, each with its own chain of accountability, running from the most junior E1 sailor all the way upward without a single gap. At the absolute apex of that structure stands one person, the commanding officer, a captain at pay grade O6, holding complete legal authority over every human being and every action aboard the vessel. Above, even the captain sits the Carrier Strike Group commander, a rear admiral who commands not just Gerald R. Ford, but the entire battle group of destroyers, cruisers, and submarines moving in formation around it. Every order on this ship has a clear origin. Every mistake has a name permanently attached to it. Aboard CVN 78 Daylight is functionally irrelevant. The sun rises and sets above the flight deck, and below it, in the depths where most of the crew lives and works, nobody notices. The ship runs on a 24-hour cycle, divided into 3 rotating 8-hour watches, 0000, 20, 800, 800 to 1600 and 1600 to 0000. Every sailor is assigned a watch section, and that assignment controls everything when they work, when they are authorized to eat, and when, if the operational tempo allows, they sleep. There is no Saturday, there is no Sunday. There is no holiday stand down, no long weekend, no Christmas morning that looks any different from a random Wednesday in the middle of the Philippine Sea. The 1MC, the ship-wide public address system, crackles to life every 15 to 30 minutes with orders, announcements, and alerts that layer over each other across all 25 decks without pause. Silence aboard Gerald R. Ford is not a feature of this environment. It is an absence that almost never occurs. Long before most of the ship stirs, the aviation cycle has already been running for hours. Pilots and weapons systems officers of CVW 8 settle into squadron ready rooms for the mission. Brief a 90-minute intelligence and tactical session covering threat environments, weather windows, bingo fuel fields, communication frequencies, and emergency egress procedures. While that brief is still running, the flight deck crew is already topside in darkness, physically repositioning aircraft by hand signal and tow tractor into their designated launch sequence. The Carrier Air Traffic Control Center, CATCC, has been sweeping radar and issuing airspace clearances since before midnight. The arresting gear officers have already tested all 4 Mark 7 mod, 3 arresting wires for correct tension and mechanical integrity. By the time the first aircraft of the day sits on Catapult 1, with engines wound to full military power, the ship has already been running at full operational tempo for hours. On a high-intensity deployment, USS Gerald R, Ford will execute an average of 160 fixed-wing flight operations in a single day. On the flight deck of an active carrier, spoken language is useless. Ambient noise near an operating emails catapult regularly exceeds 140 decibels, a level that causes immediate permanent hearing damage and renders shouting completely inaudible from 3 feet away. The solution is a color-coded jersey system that has been the operational language of USS carrier flight deck since World War II. Yellow shirts are aircraft directors. They control the physical movement of every aircraft on deck through a precise vocabulary of hand signals that pilots are trained to follow without question. Red shirts are ordnance men. They own every live weapon, every armed missile, and every loaded gun system on the flight deck. Green shirts operate the EMALS catapults and the Mark 7 arresting gear. Blue shirts move aircraft by tow tractor. Purple shirts, universally nicknamed grapes, handle all aviation fuel transfers. White shirts monitor safety and quality control across the entire deck. Brown shirts are plane captains, each personally and professionally accountable for the mechanical readiness of one specific assigned aircraft. 7 colors, 7 distinct roles, and if any one of them steps outside their lane for even a moment, the consequences are immediate and frequently irreversible. While the flight deck roars at 140 decibels under open sky, 3 decks directly below. A 21-year-old culinary specialist is 6 hours into a 12-hour galley shift, quietly and methodically prepping vegetables under fluorescent lighting with no awareness of what is happening above his head. These 2 realities, the controlled violence of an active flight deck and the silent, relentless labor of the ship's interior, exist simultaneously at every hour of every day, separated by nothing more than a few layers of steel plate and a ladder well. The sailors in each world experience the same deployment in entirely different ways. Flight deck crews measure their days in launch counts and successful recoveries. Engineering watches measure theirs in reactor logs and coolant pressure readings. Supply division measures theirs in meal head counts and inventory drawdowns. One ship, 5,000 entirely separate versions of the same 9 months playing out in parallel. When someone questions whether the flight deck is truly as dangerous as described, there is one number that ends the conversation. Since 1949, the United States Navy has recorded more than 12,000 fatalities directly connected to carrier aviation operations, and the overwhelming majority of those deaths did not occur in combat. They occurred during routine flight operations, in peacetime, on the deck itself. A sailor pulled into a jet intake during an engine run. A plane captain struck by a taxiing aircraft in low visibility. A weapons misfire during an ordnance transfer. The men and women in those colored jerseys work within meters of jet exhaust, reaching 600 degrees Celsius, on a deck that pitches with open ocean swells, surrounded by aircraft weighing up to 30 tons, moving in multiple directions simultaneously. The average age of a flight deck crew member aboard Gerald R. Ford is 21 years old. 3 years ago, most of them were sitting in a high school classroom. When the last aircraft of the day finally touches down and the flight deck goes quiet, those 5,000 people disappear below decks. And what happens in the spaces the cameras never follow them into is a story that is stranger, harder, and far more human than anything you have seen on the surface. Every sailor at pay grade E1 through E4 aboard USS Gerald R. 4 lives in a berthing compartment shared with between 60 and 120 other people. Their bed, called a rack, measures 9 meters long and zero point 0.6 meters wide, stacked 3 tiers high, separated from the person sleeping 6 inches above them by nothing more than a thin privacy curtain. Their entire personal universe beyond that rack consists of a single storage locker, measuring 0.03 cubic meters, smaller than a standard carry-on suitcase. That locker must contain every item of clothing, every personal belonging, every photograph and letter from home that they are permitted to bring for the next 9 months. Senior enlisted sailors at E7 and above earn smaller shared cabins with fewer occupants. Officers get private or semi-private staterooms. But at every level, in every compartment, the one thing nobody gets, regardless of rank, is a window. Most people assume the hardest part of living on a carrier is the danger. It is not. It is the sound. Even in the berthing compartments located several decks below the flight deck, the ambient noise floor never drops below 65 to 85 decibels, roughly equivalent to sleeping beside a busy highway that operates continuously, without pause, for 9 months straight. The ventilation systems roar. The hull groans against ocean pressure. The 1MC public address system bleeds through every bulkhead at all hours. Sailors learn to sleep through noise levels that would keep most civilians awake indefinitely, developing a fractured, shallow rest cycle that accumulates into a slow, grinding form of exhaustion that no amount of coffee fully addresses. The ship does not go quiet. It simply becomes the permanent background frequency of your existence. Deeper inside the ship in the engineering spaces, the supply storerooms, the reactor compartments, and the lower berthing decks, natural light does not exist. Fluorescent panels run at the same intensity at midnight as they do at noon. During periods of high operational tempo, when flight operations run continuously and watch rotations compress. Some sailors go 3 to 5 consecutive days without ever stepping above deck. No sunlight, no horizon, no visual confirmation that the world beyond this steel corridor still exists. The human circadian system, designed over millennia to track daylight, receives no input whatsoever. Sleep disorders, irritability, and a particular brand of psychological flatness that veteran sailors simply call the fog become standard features of life below decks rather than exceptions to it. The ship's 4 enlisted mess decks run 24 hours a day on a rotating 6-week menu cycle, deducting approximately $1, $50 per meal directly from each sailor's paycheck. The food is nutritionally adequate and occasionally, by institutional standards, genuinely good. What it cannot provide is comfort in the deeper sense, the sense of sitting at a table that belongs to you, in a home that is yours, surrounded by people you chose. Contact with family runs through the MWR Morale, Welfare and Recreation System emails subject to content screening for operationally sensitive information. Phone calls limited to 15 minutes per day when bandwidth allows. When the ship enters MCON and Mission Control Protocol, cutting all electromagnetic transmissions to avoid detection, every line of communication goes dark simultaneously. No calls, no emails, no exceptions. A sailor whose wife is in labor, whose father is in the hospital, whose child just said their first word receives that information hours or days later, through a message that was already old when it was sent. USS Gerald R. Ford is, without exception, a dry ship. Not a drop of alcohol exists anywhere in its 337 meters. No beer, no wine, no spirits of any kind, not even in the officer wardrooms. Violation means an immediate court-martial, loss of rank, and the effective end of a naval career. Romantic relationships between sailors within the same chain of command are categorically prohibited, a rule enforced across a population of 5,000 men and women living in conditions of extreme proximity for 9 consecutive months. The ship has a gym, a library, a barbershop, a chapel, and a small convenience store called the Ship Store, selling toiletries and snacks. These amenities exist not as luxuries, but as deliberate psychological pressure valves, engineered into the design of the vessel specifically because the Navy understands what happens to human beings when those valves are removed. According to research published by the Defense Health Agency, between 18 and 22% of sailors report symptoms of anxiety or adjustment disorder following a 9-month deployment. The actual figure is almost certainly higher. Military culture has never made it easy to raise your hand and say that you are not fine. If you had to choose 9 months of this for $1,800 to $2,500 a month, would you do it? Leave your answer below. Because the harder question isn't whether you could survive it. The harder question is, why do so many of them choose to come back and do it again? Pull back far enough from the individual human stories of the lost sleep, the rationed phone calls, the rack that is too small, and the locker that holds an entire life, and a different picture comes into focus. USS Gerald R. Ford is not simply a warship. It is a geopolitical instrument of a scale and sophistication that has no equivalent in human history. Its carrier air wing can strike targets across a combat radius exceeding 1,000 nautical miles. Its radar systems can simultaneously track hundreds of contacts across an area larger than most European countries. Its presence in a given body of water does not merely threaten military action, it physically restructures the decision-making calculus of every government within range. Diplomatic cables change tone, naval provocations get quietly stood down. Territorial assertions become suddenly more negotiable. USS Gerald R. Ford has never needed to fire a single weapon to alter the behavior of nation states. Its existence in the region is the message. Since the 1960s, a pattern has repeated itself with remarkable consistency across administrations, across political parties, and across decades of shifting global alliances. When a crisis erupts, a conflict escalation, a humanitarian catastrophe, a sudden regional destabilization, the first operational question asked in the White House Situation Room is not about sanctions, not about diplomatic channels, not about intelligence assessments. It is, where is our carrier strike group? The United States Navy currently operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, more than every other nation on Earth combined. The next closest competitor operates 2. That asymmetry is not an accident of history. It is a sustained, deliberate expression of strategic intent maintained across 80 years of naval policy. And every single component of that intent, every radar sweep, every flight operation, every reactor log entry depends on the 5,000 human beings keeping the machine running from the inside. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb is 28 years old. He is an email systems technician responsible for the electromagnetic launch system that hurls aircraft off the flight deck at 265 kilometers per hour. This is his 3rd deployment. He was at sea, unreachable, when his daughter was born. He learned about it 6 hours after it happened, through an email that had been queued behind operational traffic. He re-enlisted anyway. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen is an FA-18E Super Hornet pilot, one of fewer than 14% of carrier-based aviators who are women. She has completed more than 200 arrested landings on a moving flight deck at night, in conditions where the margin between a successful recovery and a fatal ramp strike is measured in feet and fractions of a second. She could earn 3 times her current salary in the civilian aviation sector. She has not left. Neither Webb nor Chen is here because the compensation makes financial sense. The math has never worked in their favor. They are here for something the spreadsheet cannot capture. The world looks at CVN 78 and sees power. It sees technology, projection, dominance, the hard steel vocabulary of geopolitical supremacy. What the camera never finds is a general surgeon performing an emergency appendectomy in an operating room that tilts with the ocean swells, with no backup facility within 500 miles. It never finds the 19-year-old writing a handwritten letter to his mother because his email allotment ran out 3 days ago. It never finds the nuclear technician running a reactor safety check at 3 in the morning, alone in a compartment that hums with controlled fission, knowing that a single procedural error does not just end a career, it ends the ship. These are not the sacrifices of people following orders under compulsion. These are the sacrifices of people who understand, with complete clarity, exactly what they signed up for and showed up anyway. Seen from a distance from a trailing destroyer, from a passing aircraft, From a satellite image taken at altitude USS Gerald R, forward at night looks nothing like a warship. It looks like a city. 5,000 points of light bleeding through portholes and hatch seals in the gap beneath watertight doors. Drifting through absolute darkness across 337 meters of ocean that has no shore in any direction. 2 nuclear reactors pulse beneath the waterline. The flight deck sits empty and dark above it all, cooling in the night air, waiting for the cycle to begin again. The $13 billion machine is not running on its A-1B reactors. It is running on the 5,000 people inside it who chose, this morning and every morning before it, to stay. If this story changed the way you think about discipline and sacrifice, leave a like, not for this channel, for them. And if you want to keep seeing the truths that don't make the headlines, hit subscribe. That's not supporting a YouTube channel. That's choosing to look at the world one layer deeper than you did yesterday.